Flaxborough had never misplaced an undertaker before. It was, on the whole, the sort of town that expected its ceremonies, civic or sepulchral, to proceed with punctual dignity. So when the funeral of Mrs. Doris Pell, late organist of St. Jude's, failed to commence at the advertised hour of 11, there was a distinct ripple of moral discomfort. The mourners stood about the churchyard in their respectable greys and mauves, each pretending not to notice the growing gap in the proceedings. A few tried to look mournful while peering up the road, as though the hearse might yet come trundling into view, its polished sides flashing contrition. "Perhaps he's taken the wrong turning," murmured Mrs. Teat, whose brother-in-law had once done the same thing on the way to his own wedding. Miss Lucilla Pride sniffed. "Mr. Blenkinsop has never been late for a funeral. Weddings, possibly, but never a funeral." Inside the vestry, the Reverend Sproat paced between the cassock hooks with the patience of a man rehearsing indignation. He had long held that Flaxborough's temporal arrangements lacked the moral backbone of his early curacies in Lincolnshire, and this, an absent undertaker, would serve nicely as an illustration during next Sunday's sermon. At 20 minutes past 11, the floral tributes began to sag in the mild spring sun. Mrs. Pell's coffin, one presumed, was still at Blenkinsop and Son. Funeral furnishers, Etty 1882, a business renowned for its mahogany finish and discreet instalment plans. Thee and Son had been quietly retired when young Neville Blenkinsop took up dentistry instead, an irony the town never tired of mentioning. Constable Malley, stationed at the gate in case anyone attempted to leave early, ambled over to the vicar. "Beg pardon, sir, but should we perhaps, telephone the premises?" Reverend Sproat frowned. "It would be most irregular, Constable. The deceased cannot be expected to wait upon the convenience of the living." Nevertheless, 10 minutes later, the vicar's wife had done precisely that. Her report was not encouraging. The shop was locked, the curtains drawn, and no one answered repeated knocks. "Though I distinctly heard the clock chiming inside," she added, with an air of faint accusation. By noon, gossip had spread from the churchyard to the Crown Hotel, where several mourners had quietly migrated under the pretext of restorative sherry. Here, among the low murmur of lunchtime diners, theories multiplied like midges. "Heart attack," said one. "Eloped," offered another, less optimistically. "More likely run off with someone's deposits," said Mr. Larch, who managed the cooperative bank and regarded sudden disappearances as an occupational hazard. It was just after 12:30 that a small procession arrived at the police station. Reverend Sproat, Mrs. Teat for moral support, and Constable Malley, who looked deeply apologetic for being alive. Sergeant Love, who had seen most forms of civic calamity short of a coup d'etat, received them with calm curiosity. "Missing undertaker, is it?" he repeated, not unkindly. "Well, that's a new one." They stood in awkward silence until a door at the far end opened and Inspector Purbright emerged, hatless, sleeves rolled, and faintly dusted with filing powder. "Good morning," he said, in that polite, level tone which sounded as if he might be addressing either a parish meeting or an armed intruder. "Something out of the ordinary?" The Reverend gave a brief moral account of events. Purbright listened with courteous attention, nodding once or twice and offering no interruption. When the clergyman reached his peroration, "And the body, Inspector, is at this very moment awaiting Christian burial," Purbright merely said, "Ah, then we had best begin by ensuring it remains so." Within the hour he was standing outside Blenkinsop and Son, gazing at the curtained windows. The brass nameplate gleamed in the sunshine, recently polished, and the faint smell of lilies drifted from the letterbox. The door resisted his knock. The keyhole looked undisturbed. Purbright crouched examining the threshold. Dust undisturbed. The narrow alley leading to the backyard showed two sets of footprints, one heavy, one small, fading into the gravel near the side gate. He straightened up. regarding the silent shop with the faintest suggestion of amusement. Flaxborough, he thought, was at its most interesting when nothing whatsoever seemed to have happened. Behind him, Constable Malley cleared his throat. "Shall I fetch the spare key from Mrs. Blenkinsop, sir?" Purbright looked at him mildly. "If you can do so without alarming her unnecessarily." "Yes, sir. Though I rather think she'll be alarmed already." As Malley trotted off, Purbright turned once more to the door, his reflection faintly visible in the polished glass. Inside, somewhere beyond the dim hallway, a clock ticked with serene indifference to all human schedules. He smiled faintly. Time in Flaxborough was never quite as dead as it seemed. The vicarage clock had just struck 4 when the first real gust of gossip reached the afternoon tea shops of Flaxborough. By then, Mrs. Pell's mourners had dispersed, not so much dismissed as evaporated into small conversational vapours across town. The floral tributes were already wilting against the church wall, and the Reverend's patience had wilted with them. He was last seen striding homeward, muttering something about professional standards in the mortuary trade. At the same hour, Mrs. Teat and Miss Lucilla Pride were sharing a buttered tea cake at the Crown Hotel, each pretending to have come in merely to rest the feet. Mrs. Teat, who could rest her feet for entire afternoons without remorse, was already deep in speculation. "It's my belief," she said with satisfaction, "that Mr. Blenkinsop has done himself a mischief. Those embalming chemicals, well, one sniff too many, and a man might mistake himself for his own client." Miss Pride folded her hands neatly. "Don't be absurd, Cora. He's a professional. Besides, didn't you say his wife was seen buying stamps only yesterday? You don't buy stamps when there's been a tragedy. It's hardly the thing." "That depends," replied Mrs. Teat darkly, "on who the stamps were for." At a nearby table, the postmistress, Mrs. Edge, pricked up her ears while pretending to stir sugar. Within 10 minutes, the version circulating through the back rooms of the post office was that Mrs. Blenkinsop had mailed a letter that morning to a certain lady in Grimsby. By the time the tale reached the grocer's, it had expanded to include a missing insurance policy, a suspected will, and the rumour that Mr. Blenkinsop had been seen boarding a bus in disguise. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, was listening to a rather different version of events from Constable Malley, who had returned from the Undertaker's residence looking slightly flushed and profoundly sympathetic. "She's very upset, sir," Malley reported. "Didn't cry exactly, but the sort of silence that's worse than shouting. Said he left the house as usual this morning, 8 o'clock sharp. Took his lunch and a small parcel, said he might be out late if the weather held." "Did she mention where he was going?" asked Purbright. "No, sir. Just that he'd been preoccupied these past few days. She thought it might be the church invoices." Purbright nodded slowly, gazing through the office window, where the late sunlight was gilding the rooftops. Preoccupation is a common malady in Flaxborough, Malley, sometimes fatal to peace, though seldom to life." He reached for his hat. "Let us pay a call on the shop again before dusk. The air may have cleared since morning." The two men walked down High Street, where the last of the shoppers were retreating behind lace curtains and evening kettles. Blenkinsop and Son looked precisely as it had before, shuttered, discreet, and faintly perfumed with the mingled scents of polish and wilted blooms. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. The faint hum of a fly, the tick of the clock inside, the peculiar stillness of a place accustomed to quiet, all seemed now to suggest watchfulness rather than absence. Purbright tried the door once more. Still locked. He peered through the narrow crack of the curtain, seeing only the blurred outline of a counter and what might have been a tall hat resting on it. He made a small note in his pocketbook, though Malley could not see what it was. "I'll need the list of his recent clients," Purbright said at last. "Ask Mrs. Blenkinsop for his appointment ledger when you return. Gently, if possible." "Yes, sir." "Tell her," Purbright added, "that it's purely routine." We wouldn't want unnecessary alarm to find its way into the evening edition. By the time they reached the police station again, the evening papers had already arrived from the printworks 2 streets away. The Flaxborough Gazette headline read, with more enterprise than accuracy, "Local Undertaker vanishes. Funeral delayed." Beneath, in smaller print, "Police say no cause for alarm." Purbright smiled faintly at that. He had said no such thing. At 6:30, the telephone rang. It was Mrs. Edge from the post office speaking in the careful tone of one who knows something confidential yet urgent. "Inspector, I wouldn't normally intrude," she began, "but a letter came through this morning, addressed in Mr. Blenkinsop's hand, or one strikingly like it. Posted last night according to the stamp. It was sent to a Mr. Arthur Phipps, number 17, The Crescent. You may not recall the name, but he's that gentleman who, makes the wax wreaths." Purbright thanked her politely and replaced the receiver. For several moments he sat gazing at the blank sheet on his desk, the faintest smile on his lips. A letter posted before the disappearance, addressed to a maker of wreaths. One could almost admire the symmetry. At that moment, Sergeant Love entered with the evening constable's report. "No sign of him anywhere, sir?" "The hearse is still in the garage, untouched. And the milk standing outside the back door?" Purbright nodded. "Very good. Keep an eye on the Crescent, if you would. Quietly. I've a feeling our missing man hasn't gone far. In fact," he leaned back, folding his hands, "he may be waiting for someone else to find him first." Outside, the town settled into its twilight hush. In the pubs, theories brewed stronger than the beer. Mrs. Teat was already recounting how she'd seen a figure by the canal, and the Reverend Sproat's wife was certain she'd heard strange hammering. Near the chapel, by nightfall, Flaxborough had convinced itself of 3 things: that the Undertaker was either dead, guilty, or both; that Mrs. Pell's funeral had been cursed from the start, and that Inspector Purbright, with his quiet manners and unreadable smile, surely knew more than he was saying. He didn't disabuse them. Instead, at his desk beneath the slow-turning fan, he made a small note in his tidy hand. "Find Phipps. Ask about the letter. Examine shop again at dawn." Then, after a moment's pause, he added another line. "Undertakers do not vanish. They wait," and with that thought, the inspector closed his notebook, extinguished the light, and let the quiet of Flaxborough thicken around him like the evening mist that always came before something stirred. The following morning arrived with a pale, hesitant sunlight that made Flaxborough's streets look as though they had been freshly varnished for public inspection. The air carried a chill that sharpened the smell of polish and damp stone, and in it, Inspector Purbright walked at a measured pace toward High Street, his coat buttoned against the breeze and his thoughts arranged as tidily as his files. Constable Malley followed a few steps behind, carrying a small canvas bag of tools and the respectful silence of a man who preferred doors to open themselves. Blenkinsop and Son stood precisely as before, curtains drawn, brass nameplate gleaming, and an air of modest prosperity undisturbed. Purbright paused before the door, tilting his head slightly as though listening to the shop's own opinion on the matter. From within came the steady tick of the same clock, implacable as conscience. "Key, sir," Malley said quietly, holding out the one borrowed from Mrs. Blenkinsop the night before. Purbright turned it in the lock. The key resisted for a moment, an almost human hesitation, before yielding with a subdued click. The door opened an inch, then halted abruptly. Something inside pressed against it. Together they pushed gently until the obstruction shifted, scraping faintly over wood. A small, wheeled coffin trolley had been wedged against the inner handle, as if to ensure the door remained shut. It bore a folded dust sheet and a faint ring of moisture where a glass had once rested. Purbright examined it without comment, then stepped into the gloom of the shop. The scent of lilies mingled with polish and faint tobacco. Morning light filtered through the curtains, laid soft stripes across the counter and picked out the gilt lettering on a row of coffin plates. The air was still, too still, Purbright thought, for a place accustomed to discreet activity. On the counter stood a cup and saucer, half a sandwich on a plate beside it. The tea was cold, the bread stiff. Nearby lay an open ledger, the last line written in a steady, careful hand, Mrs. Pell, interment, 11 a.m. Beneath it, the pen had trailed a small loop of ink, as if its writer had paused mid-thought. "Nothing touched since yesterday," Mally murmured. "Almost nothing," said Purbright. He pointed to a faint disturbance in the layer of dust along the skirting board, a narrow scuff mark, recent and distinct. "Someone moved that chair last night." A small person, judging by the step length, they advanced into the back room. Here the air grew cooler, scented faintly with linseed oil and carnation. The walls were lined with shelves of polished urns, candles, and folded drapery. A single chair stood near the desk, its seat slightly askew, a small brown stain at its edge. Purbright examined it closely and touched it with a gloved finger. "Varnish, not blood. Still tacky." He glanced at the window. Its latch was fastened, but the sill bore a thin trace of soil, as though someone had leaned out or in. The inspector drew the curtain aside. Outside lay a narrow yard enclosed by high brick walls. The gravel path was marked by faint indentations leading toward the gate at the far end, where a low iron lock hung open. Beyond, the alley curved between two shops toward the canal. Purbright's gaze lingered on the gate for a long moment. Then, turning back into the room, he crossed to the desk and examined a stack of correspondence. The top letter was addressed to Mr. Arthur Phipps, 17 The Crescent, in Blenkinsop's familiar looping script. It was stamped but unposted. He slit it open with a paper knife, reading the contents in silence. It was a brief note, formal but uneasy. "Dear Mr. Phipps, I shall require 2 of the larger wreaths earlier than planned. Kindly keep the matter discreet until I send word. There may be difficulty." Purbright folded the paper again with careful fingers. "Difficulty," he murmured. "That's a convenient word." Mally was kneeling by the hearth, examining a small heap of ashes. "Looks like something burned here last night, sir." "Not much, just a few scraps." Purbright joined him. Among the grey flakes lay a fragment of singed paper bearing part of a heading, Department of Health and Burial Licenses. He brushed it gently with the tip of his pencil. "The rest was gone. I should think," he said, straightening, "that our Mr. Blenkinsop has mislaid more than himself, possibly a permit or 2. They made their way through the adjoining rooms, the preparation chamber, the small office, and the storage space beyond. Each held the same faint orderliness, the same air of interrupted duty. Nothing suggested violence or struggle. Everything suggested departure without farewell. By the time they stepped back into the morning light, Purbright's expression had not changed, but something in his manner had settled. He locked the door carefully and returned the key to his pocket. "Sir," Mally ventured, "if he left through the back, he could have gone straight to the canal. Easy enough to fall in after dark." "Yes," Purbright said mildly. "It's always easy enough to fall in. More difficult to do so tidily after setting one's tea aside and locking the door from within." Mally blinked. "From within, sir?" Purbright tapped the key. This was the only one. "His wife swears it hung by the door until I borrowed it. Yet the shop was locked when we arrived. Unless ghosts have taken to turning keys, someone arranged matters rather neatly." They stood for a moment, watching a milk float rattle past, the horse's hooves striking an unhurried rhythm. The normality of it all was almost insolent. "Begin inquiries with Mr. Phipps," Purbright said at last. "Politely ask if he received any further communication, and have Sergeant Love check whether any new death certificates were processed this week, particularly for anyone not yet buried." "Yes, sir." As Mally moved off, Purbright lingered by the shop door. Through the glass he could see the reflection of the opposite buildings, crisp in the morning light. It struck him that reflections in Flaxborough often said more than the originals. He turned and walked toward the station, his footsteps soft on the cobbles, his mind ticking as steadily as the clock still sounding behind the shuttered window. The town, he thought, would begin its morning with fresh talk and warm bread rolls, never noticing how close its respectability stood to farce. And somewhere, perhaps very near, the Undertaker of Flaxborough was discovering that vanishing cleanly was harder than dying neatly. Purbright smiled faintly, not at the thought of death, but at the oddities of those who pretended to master it for a living. Somewhere behind the curtains of that immaculate little shop, he was certain a single detail waited, a trivial, inconvenient truth that would, when found, make the entire affair perfectly reasonable and quietly absurd in equal measure. For now, he preferred not to hurry it. Mrs. Blenkinsop received Inspector Purbright with the careful composure of one who has rehearsed both outrage and resignation, but is uncertain which will be required. Her sitting room on Elm Crescent had the precise neatness of a place long kept under observation, lace antimacassars on every chair, framed scripture on the walls, and a faint smell of starch and lavender. A clock ticked solemnly above the mantel, marking each pause in conversation with a kind of moral emphasis. She sat upright, hands clasped tightly around a handkerchief that had not yet been used. "You must understand, Inspector, my husband is not the sort of man to disappear. He believes in punctuality, order, and, in his own way, dignity." Even his snoring had a rhythm to it. Purbright inclined his head slightly. "A virtue rare enough, Mrs. Blenkinsop. And you've had no word from him since Tuesday morning?" "None. He left the house precisely at 8, said he might be out late, and asked me to remind Miss Cribb about the order for Mrs. Pell's funeral ribbons." "That's all, Miss Cribb?" "The girl who does his typing. Well, typing and sympathy letters. It seems the bereaved take comfort in neat margins." Purbright's eyes softened with faint amusement. "May I speak with her presently?" "If you must," she said, with a trace of reluctant authority. "She lives above the shop, though I doubt she slept there last night. She's a sensitive creature, too sensitive for her own good." Purbright made a small note in his book. "And your husband's manner recently, any change?" Her expression flickered, the first sign of hesitation. He was distracted, perhaps. Not unhappy exactly, but thoughtful. He'd begun writing letters after supper. "Business," he said, though he wouldn't let me see them. And on Sunday he took a long walk by the canal. He never walks without purpose, Inspector. Did he mention what troubled him? He said only that certain arrangements were not as tidy as he would wish. Her mouth tightened slightly. It was an odd remark, even for him. Purbright regarded her with mild sympathy. "You're bearing up well, Mrs. Blenkinsop." Her lips pursed. "There's no sense in hysteria. People talk enough in this town without being given encouragement." "Quite so," said Purbright. "And I suspect they're already industrious in that regard." She allowed herself a small, brittle smile. "Oh, I imagine so. If my husband had fallen into the canal, half of Flaxborough would be wringing out the towels by now." Purbright rose, thanked her with quiet courtesy, and asked if he might look in at the shop once more, particularly the upper rooms. She consented with a nod, though the stiffness in her shoulders suggested that permission was a formality rather than generosity. The staircase above Blenkinsop and Son creaked faintly under his step, the wood old and well waxed. At the top was a small landing lined with sepia photographs of funerals long past, carriages, black horses, and groups of mourners whose solemnity had outlived their names. A door stood ajar at the end of the corridor, and from within came the sound of someone hastily rising from a chair. "Miss Cribb." Purbright's tone was gentle but clear. The young woman who turned to face him could not have been more than 25, though her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, made her appear older. Her blouse was fastened unevenly at the collar, and a typewriter sat beside her on the small table, a sheet of paper still rolled into it, its last line unfinished. "Oh, Inspector," she stammered.
I didn't expect anyone so soon. I'm sorry to intrude.
"I understand you work closely with Mr. Blenkinsop." She nodded, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. "Every day for nearly 3 years. He was a fair man, really. Quiet, particular about everything. Sometimes he made me rewrite a sympathy letter 3 times, but he always said, 'The bereaved notice detail, Fenella.' Did he seem—"
Troubled lately?
Her eyes darted to the window before she answered.
Yes, I mean, he was nervous.
Kept locking the shop after hours, wouldn't let me file the invoices. He said something about an irregularity in the books, but I thought he only meant arithmetic. Did he mention anyone? Customers, acquaintances causing him concern? She hesitated, biting her lip. "There was a man came twice last week. Tall, thin, a bit pale. He said he was an organ repairer, come about Mrs. Pell's arrangements."
I didn't see him after that, but Mr. Blenkinsop looked worse each time he left.
"The second day, he told me to burn a receipt and forget the visit." Purbright's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly.
You did as he asked? I tried, but it wouldn't burn completely. I threw the rest in the stove. He gave a small, reassuring smile.
"Quite right. No harm done?"
And this man, did he give his name?
"Only Mr. Reed, or Reed, I'm not sure which." Purbright made a note, his pencil barely whispering. "You've been very helpful, Miss Cribb. One last thing, do you know whether your employer kept any personal diary or notebook?" She looked toward the desk. There was a small black book in the top drawer. He always carried it, even to funerals.
But it isn't there now. Purbright walked to the desk and opened the drawer.
Inside lay a few pens, a stray cufflink, and a packet of peppermints. The book was indeed missing. When he turned back, she was crying softly, the kind of tears that escape when silence becomes unbearable. He waited until the sound steadied. "Miss Cribb," he said quietly, "I don't believe your employer intended to harm himself. He may, however, have found himself in someone else's way." Her eyes lifted, wide and frightened. "Do you think he's dead, Inspector?" Purbright's voice was calm, almost kind.
I think he's misplaced, Miss Cribb. And misplaced things in Flaxborough have a habit of turning up, often where one least expects. He left her to her tears and descended the stairs.
The sunlight through the frosted glass of the door caught his reflection as he paused on the threshold, his face thoughtful but unreadable. Outside, the morning had grown warmer, yet the air carried that faint, unmistakable scent of something turning, like flowers just past their bloom. Purbright drew a slow breath and looked down the quiet street, where life continued with its usual decorum, untouched for now by whatever truth waited beneath the surface. He adjusted his hat and walked away, already thinking not of death but of detail. By the following afternoon, Flaxborough had already reached several unanimous conclusions about the fate of Mr. Blenkinsop, each mutually exclusive, yet held with equal conviction. It was, as Purbright reflected while reading the Gazette, a town blessed with a surplus of certainty and a shortage of facts. In the snug of the Crown Hotel, Councillor Chubb was declaring to anyone within Ailes' reach that the Undertaker had done the decent thing, couldn't face ruin. Poor devil. Across from him, Mrs. Teat countered that men of Blenkinsop's build didn't drown, they floated. Miss Pride nodded gravely, observing that people of weak moral fibre always vanish after tea. The postmistress, listening nearby, wondered aloud if vanishing could now be done by correspondence. By evening, a theory of financial disgrace had taken root like ivy, spreading through the stationers, curling up the vicarage gate and clinging to the window ledges of the police station itself. Sergeant Love, dutifully recording every whisper that might one day be quoted back to its author, brought Purbright a tidy summary. "Seems the town's decided he forged burial certificates," the sergeant reported, "or maybe sold coffins twice over." Purbright, seated behind his desk, regarded the ceiling with mild interest. "An efficient man might indeed achieve that, Sergeant, though it does rather complicate the collection of payment." Love permitted himself a faint smile.
Council's pressing for an official statement, sir.
Councillor Chubb says it's a moral issue. It usually is when someone else's reputation is at stake, said Purbright. He closed the Gazette, which bore the latest headline, Mystery Deepens. Police follow private sorrow theory. The phrase made him sigh faintly. Remind me to thank the press for their psychological insight. Love hesitated. Would you like me to deny it, sir? Not at all, Purbright said mildly. It may discourage the guilty party from inventing anything more imaginative. He rose, stretching with quiet deliberation. Come along, Sergeant.
Let us be seen taking an interest.
The public grows uneasy when policemen appear to be thinking indoors. They walked together through the market square, where shopkeepers were folding awnings and gossipers were folding truths into anecdotes. The scent of freshly baked bread drifted from the bakery, mingling with the sharper tang of damp cobblestone. Near the churchyard gate, Mrs. Teat accosted them with the brisk authority of one accustomed to addressing public officials without invitation.
Inspector, I'll thank you to tell us if the man's been found.
People are starting to lose faith in the constabulary, Purbright smiled faintly. Faith, madam, is a renewable resource in Flaxborough. It seldom expires for long. Well, she said, flustered. All I know is he's either run off with someone or been dragged into the canal. It's not natural, disappearing like that. No, said Purbright, but then very little in nature involves hearses and embalming fluid, she blinked.
Uncertain whether to feel complimented or chastised.
Before she could decide, Purbright tipped his hat and moved on. At the canal bridge, Constable Malley was waiting, notebook in hand, his boots muddy to the ankles.
I've been checking the towpath, sir.
Found this? He produced a single black glove, thin, worn, and unmistakably of funeral stock. Purbright examined it without touching. Left hand, he murmured.
And no lining.
From the mortuary set, I think, Malley nodded.
Could have blown out of the yard, maybe. Perhaps, said Purbright.
Though gloves seldom travel alone. He glanced down the slow green waterway. A moorhen drifted near the reeds, untroubled by mystery. Send this to Sergeant Love for safekeeping, he said, and have him look into Mr. Reed, or Reed, the organ repairer mentioned by Miss Cribb. I suspect our missing man's troubles were more musical than moral. As Malley departed, Purbright lingered on the bridge. The air had cooled, and the last of the day's light hung low, gilding the water in thin, trembling lines. Behind him, the church bell marked 6 o'clock, each stroke echoing softly against the rows of tidy houses.
A small figure approached from the direction of the chapel, a boy with a bicycle and a newsboy's grin.
He stopped, tugging at his cap. Evening, sir.
You the inspector, aren't you?
My mum says you find things what shouldn't be found. Purbright smiled. Your mother is observant. Have you found something yourself? The boy nodded eagerly.
Behind the drapers, sir. There's a box by the bins.
Big enough for a cat.
Smells funny. Show me, said Purbright. The box lay where he described, half hidden in shadow.
Purbright knelt, lifted the lid gently, and inhaled the faint but unmistakable odour of formaldehyde. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a narrow ledger, bound in black cloth, the missing diary of Mr. Blenkinsop. Purbright straightened, the corners of his mouth tightening slightly. Well, he said quietly, our Undertaker appears to have left a note after all. He slipped the diary under his arm, thanked the boy with a coin, and walked back toward the station, his pace unhurried, his mind already shaping possibilities. Flaxborough might favour the obvious, but Purbright had learned long ago that the obvious seldom paid its rent on time. By the time he reached his office, the town's lamps were glowing amber in the damp evening air. He sat down, opened the book, and began to read. The entries were meticulous, lists of funerals, expenses, and names neatly ruled in ink. But midway through the final page, the writing changed, hurried, slanted, as though composed by someone listening for footsteps. If anything happens, Look to the canal, but not beneath it. The truth was never buried, only misplaced. Purbright closed the book slowly, his expression unreadable. Somewhere in Flaxborough the river whispered along its banks, indifferent and green. The inspector leaned back, eyes half closed, as if hearing the faint, ironic laughter of the town itself. He smiled faintly. "So much," he murmured, "for the obvious." It was the kind of morning that made Flaxborough seem incapable of wrongdoing. The sky was mild blue, the air freshly laundered by rain, and the pavements still glistened faintly where the milk carts had passed. Nothing, on the surface, suggested that the town was ready for another corpse, or the suggestion of one. Yet just after 9 o'clock, Constable Malley arrived at the police station in a state of apologetic agitation.
Hat in hand and mud on his boots, beg pardon. "Sir," he said breathlessly, "but they've pulled a body from the canal."
Behind the drapers, old Mr. Frank's barge horse sniffed it out. Purbright set down his teacup with the calm of a man who had long ago accepted that breakfast was a provisional arrangement. "Not our Undertaker, I trust," he said mildly. "No, sir," Malley replied, "though I'd swear it might have been once. Dressed decent, too. Proper black suit, shoes polished. Wallet gone, but the pockets were tidy. Not robbery, then?" Murmured Purbright, rising and collecting his hat. A tidy corpse in Flaxborough. How very considerate. The canal lay in its usual state of greenish meditation, fringed by reeds and the occasional bottle. 2 workmen and the draper himself stood nearby, their faces unified in solemn curiosity. The body had been laid upon a tarpaulin on the bank, a coat spread discreetly over its face. Purbright lifted the edge just enough to observe. The man was not Blenkinsop. The features were unfamiliar, thinner, sharper, perhaps in his late 40s, though the water had given his complexion a faint pallor of irony. His hands were pale but not swollen, his collar neatly buttoned. Purbright crouched, examining the details with patient eyes. "A professional suit," he remarked quietly. "Not local tailoring. See the stitching at the lapel, Nottingham perhaps.
And look here, Malley, the fingertips, ink stains."
A writing man, journalist.
Ventured Malley, or clerk?
Possibly both, depending on the economy of his vices. Purbright straightened and glanced toward the canal. No sign of struggle, I presume?
"None, sir."
"But there's something else. Found this about 20 yards upstream." Malley handed him a small case, metal, dented, still wet. Inside, cushioned by damp velvet, lay a set of delicate tools and a folded business card. Purbright read aloud, "Edward Reed, organ tuning and repair, Gainsborough." He closed the case slowly. "Our Mr. Reed, then. The man who came calling at the Undertaker's." A silence followed, broken only by the slow drip of water from the tarpaulin. Purbright replaced the card and looked toward the draper, who was pretending to look away. "You found him?" "Yes, Inspector," said the man, stepping forward. "Or rather, the horse did. Nearly bolted, poor thing.
"I only just saw the hand float up."
Gave me quite a turn, I can tell you. Didn't expect the dead to be so well dressed." "Few people do," said Purbright mildly. He instructed Malley to have the body taken to the mortuary and sent word for the doctor. Then, with a faint sigh, he looked at the water again. "I don't suppose the canal has anything left to offer us this week." By mid-afternoon, Dr. Hargreaves had confirmed what Purbright already suspected: death by drowning, but likely preceded by a blow to the head. The mark was small, clean, and situated just behind the ear. "Something blunt but smooth," the doctor said. "A walking stick, perhaps, or a small mallet. Accidental?" Hargreaves gave the faint, non-committal shrug of a man accustomed to civic ambiguity. "Possibly, though most accidents don't result in such careful postures of neatness." The fellow's tie was still straight. Purbright thanked him and returned to his office, where Sergeant Love awaited with the latest reports. "Nothing new on Blenkinsop, sir, but the word is Mrs. Pell's relatives are making a stir. Say they want her funeral conducted by someone reputable." "An understandable difficulty," said Purbright. Flaxborough seemed short of undertakers this week. Love hesitated, then added, "Miss Cribb came by, said she recognized the dead man. He was the same Mr. Reed who'd been to see Blenkinsop. Said they argued about something in the back room 2 days before he vanished." Purbright sat down, thoughtful. "2 men, one gone missing, the other found tidy and drowned. Both connected to a funeral that didn't occur. You'd think death might show more imagination." Love waited, watching him closely. "You think the 2 are tied, sir?" "I think they were working at opposite ends of the same lie," Purbright said quietly, "and that one of them, perhaps both, discovered the other's part too late." That evening, the town's talk turned from mystery to melodrama. The Gazette ran an extra edition, "Body Found in Canal. Strange Link to Missing Undertaker." At the Crown, the regulars debated whether murder was quite proper within town limits. Mrs. Teat, triumphant, declared it an immoral business altogether and promised to write to her Member of Parliament. Councillor Chubb suggested the council consider a formal ban on unsupervised waterways. Miss Pride, as ever, concluded that it was inevitably the result of modern relaxation. Meanwhile, Purbright walked home through the fading light, his pace deliberate. Passing the churchyard, he paused by the half-dug grave intended for Mrs. Pell. The ground was damp, the air faintly perfumed with lilies gone soft. Somewhere beyond the lich gate a cat darted between headstones. He thought of the diary, the line about the canal and the misplaced truth. It was not buried, Blenkinsop had written, only misplaced. And now one man who might have known its location was floating face down by the draper's bins. He continued walking until he reached the narrow alley behind the Undertaker's. The gate still hung open as before, but the gravel path bore new marks, smaller footprints,
pressed into damp earth leading from the back door to the lane.
Someone had been there since yesterday. He knelt, touched one with a gloved finger, and saw the faint outline of a woman's heel. "Miss Cribb," he murmured. "Or Mrs. Blenkinsop, or both." The church bell struck 7, soft and measured. Purbright rose, brushing dust from his sleeve, and looked once more at the shuttered windows of Blenkinsop and Son. Behind those blinds, somewhere, lay the thread between death and its rehearsal, a detail tidy enough to seem innocent, yet too deliberate to be chance. He turned toward the police station, his shadow stretching long and thin along the cobbles. The town, he reflected, would talk itself weary by nightfall, each tongue working industriously toward error. But by morning, when the gossip cooled, Flaxborough would wake to find that its second death had only sharpened the first. And Purbright, with his mild smile and deliberate calm, would be waiting for the next small thing, some trifle that looked harmless, but carried the weight of guilt in its silence. The following morning brought with it the faint, deceptive brightness that Flaxborough specialized in, sunlight that looked cheerful but did nothing to warm. The canal, placid and greenish, had already resumed its innocent appearance, as if no one had ever been found within it. The town, of course, had not forgiven the disturbance. Every shop counter and bar stool now hosted some fresh retelling, and every version disagreed with itself by lunchtime. Inspector Purbright, however, preferred his facts unboiled. He sat in his office, reading the post-mortem report on Edward Reed, with the same mild concentration he might have given to a railway timetable. The cause of death was confirmed as drowning, the head wound consistent with a fall against a smooth object. It was phrased, he thought, like an apology for evidence that refused to behave. Sergeant Love entered quietly, his expression torn between gravity and curiosity. "We've had word from Gainsborough, sir. Reed was a travelling organ tuner, all right.
No family used to take jobs for small churches.
He came here 3 days before he died, booked a room at the King's Arms, paid in advance. Left a small trunk behind labelled Tools." Purbright closed the report.
And inside,
Mostly what you'd expect, wrenches, tuning forks, some wires. But at the bottom there's a ledger, sir.
names, dates, amounts.
Seems he collected more than he tuned, Purbright smiled faintly. The musician's side trade, extortion, Love hesitated. Not exactly extortion, sir. More like payments from churches. Small sums, regular. But here, look at this one. He produced a photocopy of the page. Entry for Mrs. Pell, final arrangement, £30. Dated 2 days before she died. Purbright examined it, eyes half closed in thought. A final arrangement. Curious phrasing.
I wonder whose arrangement it truly was, Love shifted.
There's more. Blenkinsop's name appears twice, once next to Mrs. Pell, and once 2 months earlier, marked Retainer. Purbright leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. So our Undertaker was paying an organ tuner. Not quite the usual relationship. And the same organ tuner ends up dead in the canal, his client, Mrs. Pell, buried in postponement. I begin to think Flaxborough's music is more harmonious than we knew. Love frowned slightly. You think Mrs. Pell's death ties in, sir? I think her death, her will, and her funeral form a trio in rather uneasy key. He stood, reached for his coat, and motioned toward the door.
Come, Sergeant.
Let us pay a visit to Mrs. Pell's solicitor. The dead are quiet, but their paperwork can be most eloquent. The offices of Mather and Rillstone were tucked above the ironmongers, 2 rooms with threadbare carpet, and the faint smell of ink and pipe tobacco. Mr. Mather himself, small, neat, and apologetically precise.
Received Purbright as though the inspector might at any moment demand his confession. Mrs. Pell's affairs?
Mather said, blinking through rimless spectacles.
Ah, yes.
We drew up a revised will a fortnight before her death. The alterations were minor, some small bequest to the church, a change of executor. Executor? Purbright asked. Indeed, Mr. Blenkinsop. She insisted upon it. Said he was trustworthy in matters of finality, her phrase, not mine, and before him.
Her nephew, one Cyril Pell, a clerk in Leicester. She claimed he had disappointed her morally. In what fashion?
Mather looked uncomfortable. She did not specify.
I gathered it involved a lady and a sum of money insufficient to satisfy either. Purbright nodded, considering this. And the nephew, did he attend the funeral?
He intended to. Arrived, I believe, to find there was no funeral to attend. When they left, Love muttered, That's a motive right there, sir. Change the will, cut out the nephew, Undertaker goes missing, and the man she paid turns up dead. Indeed, said Purbright, walking slowly down the narrow stairs. But which of them had the wit to make it look like a tragedy instead of a transaction? They stopped at the corner by the church, where the florist's window displayed its usual assortment of wreaths and ribbons. Among them, Purbright noticed a card bearing the name Arthur Phipps, the maker of artificial flowers who had once supplied Blenkinsop's displays. He entered the shop, where the air smelled faintly of glue and dried petals. Mr. Phipps, round-faced and perpetually pink about the eyes, greeted them with the air of one caught between embarrassment and pride. Good morning, Inspector. I heard about poor Blenkinsop. Terrible business. He owed me for 2 wreaths, you know, though I'm not one to speak ill. Purbright's tone was courteous but pointed. You received a letter from him shortly before his disappearance, I believe. Phipps blinked, then nodded.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Said he'd need 2 of the larger models sooner than expected. Wanted them kept discreet. I thought it odd. But then, he was always particular about presentation.
Never one to leave things to chance. Would these have been for Mrs. Pell?
I assumed so, but he didn't say.
Only that I should have them ready by Thursday.
Of course, Thursday came, and no one did. Purbright studied him a moment longer. You didn't happen to see anyone collecting them? No, sir, but I did notice someone standing across the road that morning. Young woman, pale, with a handbag clutched to her chest, looked frightened.
I thought she might be waiting for him, Miss Cribb.
Perhaps, murmured Love. Possibly, said Purbright, though his tone suggested more thought than agreement. As they stepped back into the street, the bell of St. Jude's struck the hour. Purbright turned his gaze toward the waterway, visible beyond the rooftops. "The living, Sergeant," he said softly, "are always more troublesome than the dead." The latter seldom insist on explanations. Love looked puzzled. "What do you mean, sir?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Only that our undertaker seems to have prepared 2 wreaths in advance, one perhaps for his client, and one for the man who came asking questions about her. The trouble, I fear, is that he miscounted the number of mourners required." They walked on in silence, the canal's reflection glimmering faintly through the trees. Somewhere a barge bell chimed, and a gull wheeled lazily overhead. The stillness carried with it a sense of something held in suspension, threads of deceit stretching between the living and the dead, each waiting for the other to break. Purbright stopped, eyes narrowing slightly. "We'll need to visit Mrs. Blenkinsop again," he said. "I think she knows why her husband ordered those wreaths early, and perhaps why one was never used." Love hesitated. "You think she's involved, sir?" "I think she's patient," said Purbright, "and patience in Flaxborough is rarely innocent." He turned, coat brushing softly in the wind, and started toward Elm Crescent, where the curtains were already twitching in quiet expectation. The Crown Hotel, that most reliable of Flaxborough's listening posts, was in its evening mood, lamp-lit, subdued, and faintly humming with speculation. Inspector Purbright had chosen his usual corner table in the lounge, the one that offered both privacy and a view of the bar, where conversation collected like steam against a mirror. His pint of mild sat untouched for several minutes as he studied its amber surface, the way a man might examine a map he alone could read. Outside, rain drizzled across the market square, softening the edges of the gaslights. Inside, the voices of the regulars ebbed and swelled, Mrs. Teat recounting the undertaker's last sighting to a retired station master who pretended disbelief, Councillor Chubb pontificating about the moral decay of the professional class, and the landlord, Mr. Harbut, pretending to wipe the counter while missing nothing of the conversation. Purbright, who had long ago accepted that Flaxborough's chief industry was the manufacture of conjecture, found the rhythm oddly comforting. The town's gossip served, after all, as its weather, a continuous drizzle of suspicion, never quite clearing, never quite storming. He sipped his beer, folded one hand around the glass, and let his thoughts drift through the day's discoveries. A missing undertaker, a drowned organ tuner, 2 wreaths ordered in advance, and a will redrawn under peculiar circumstances. Nothing yet that shouted guilt, but everything whispered it. What connected them all, he wondered, was not death, but arrangement. Each act, the will, the payment, the disappearance, was too tidy, too deliberate. Death in Flaxborough was usually accidental in both cause and character. This one had been organized. A shadow moved near the bar. It was Mrs. Blenkinsop. She was dressed more soberly than usual, her black coat buttoned high, her gloves still on. When she saw Purbright, she hesitated, then approached with the slow resolve of someone unwilling but resigned to necessity. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head slightly.
"I thought I might find you here."
"I won't sit long." "Please do," said Purbright, rising and drawing out a chair. "The company will improve both our reputations." She managed a brief, brittle smile. That would be quite the accomplishment. When she sat, she kept her gloves folded in her lap. For a moment neither spoke. Then she said quietly, "I hear they've found another body." "Indeed. Not your husband's, though connected to him in ways we're still untangling." "I see." Her eyes remained steady, though her mouth trembled faintly at the corners.
"Edward Reed, wasn't it?"
"My husband mentioned the name once. Said the man was overcharging for sentiment." "Overcharging?"
"He meant the organ music," she said.
Apparently Mrs. Pell wanted something grand for her farewell. Mr. Reed agreed, provided payment was arranged privately. Purbright studied her. "Did your husband ever mention what troubled him about that arrangement?" She looked down. only that it might end awkwardly. Those were his words. He said people in grief forget to settle accounts, and others remember too much. Her tone was calm, but there was a tired precision to it, as though she were measuring each sentence before release. Purbright leaned slightly forward, his voice almost kind. "Mrs. Blenkinsop, has it occurred to you that your husband may have discovered something unpleasant about this Mr. Reed? Something beyond business?" She met his gaze with sudden, brittle defiance. "My husband discovered unpleasant things about everyone. It was his profession. And yet he left his work unfinished," Purbright said softly. "Which was not." Her composure wavered, then returned, like a curtain drawn too quickly. "If he's dead, Inspector, I hope it was sudden. If he's alive, I hope it wasn't by choice." Purbright said nothing for a moment, allowing the sounds of the room to fill the silence. The clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the soft rain beyond the windows. When he spoke again, his tone was quieter still. "Tell me, Mrs. Blenkinsop, did your husband ever speak of Mrs. Pell's will?" She hesitated too long.
Only that it was in order. I know she'd made him executor.
He thought it an honor. "Honor can be heavy," said Purbright.
Especially when it carries someone else's secret. Her eyes lifted sharply.
"You think he had something to hide?" "I think," Purbright replied, "he was asked to conceal something and found the burden less bearable than expected." Mrs. Blenkinsop's hands tightened around her gloves until the leather creaked. Then she rose, smoothing her skirt. "If you're implying my husband was dishonest, you're mistaken."
He was meticulous.
"Perhaps too much so. He wouldn't have left without purpose." "Of that," said Purbright, "I'm certain." She turned to go, but paused.
"Inspector."
"If you find him alive or dead, I'd rather you didn't tell me immediately. Some news, I think, should arrive politely late." When she was gone, Purbright sat back, watching her cross the square beneath her umbrella, her silhouette absorbed by the lamplight and rain. He knew restraint when he saw it. Flaxborough's women possessed it in abundance, though rarely for the same reasons. The landlord approached, polishing a glass. "Bit of a stir again tonight, sir. Folks saying the canal's cursed now." "Ah," said Purbright mildly. "Then at least it's acquired character." Harbert grinned.
"You'll have them digging for more bodies soon enough." "Perhaps," said Purbright.
"But I'm rather hoping to find the living one first." He finished his pint and stood, slipping into his coat. Outside, the rain had eased to a fine mist. The market square lay empty except for puddles that reflected the lamps like small, wavering moons. As he walked back toward the station, he allowed his thoughts to settle into order. A widow's patience, a secretary's tears, an organ tuner's ambition, and an undertaker's precision, all separate threads, yet drawn from the same spool. Somewhere, he felt sure, they converged, not in death, but in something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more human. Deceit born of vanity. And though the town slept, content in its nightly chorus of conjecture, Purbright felt no weariness. Somewhere behind those drawn curtains, one person still waited for morning, with the unease of someone who had buried more than truth. He smiled faintly into the mist. Flaxborough, as ever, would tidy itself by breakfast, but the inspector, unhurried and methodical, would still be watching for the crease beneath the linen. The following afternoon carried with it that pale, undecided sunlight which always seemed to make Flaxborough pause between virtue and mischief. The town had grown tired of its own theories, and the matter of the missing Undertaker was beginning to settle into that comfortable category of mystery best left unsolved, something to nod over between the second and third cups of tea. Purbright, however, showed no signs of weariness. He sat in his office, sleeves rolled, the edges of a newspaper advertisement freshly clipped on his blotter. It read simply, "Unfinished arrangement, discreet inquiry for the party concerned. Please contact a friend through the Gazette office." The inspector read it once more, then folded the paper neatly and slid it aside. Sergeant Love, watching from the other desk, cleared his throat cautiously. "If I may say so, sir, that doesn't seem much of a clue." "It isn't meant to be," said Purbright, his tone mild. "It's a whisper, not a statement. The kind of whisper that unsettles someone who's been listening for it." Love frowned. "You mean to draw them out?" "Only a little," said Purbright. "Sometimes truth hides better when you chase it. Better to leave a door open and see who tiptoes through." By the next morning, the advertisement had appeared in the Gazette's classifieds, where it nestled comfortably between notices for piano lessons and a second-hand lawn-mower. By noon, according to the editor's secretary, 2 telephone inquiries had already been made, one by a woman who sounded breathless and another by a man who hung up after asking if it referred to that business near the canal. Purbright received this information with the faintest smile.
"Good," he said.
"They're both still alive." That evening, he took his usual slow walk through the high street, his hands clasped behind him, appearing as benignly domestic as the street lamps that flickered to life one by one. He stopped outside the Gazette office just as the last of the staff were leaving. The editor himself, a tall man with thinning hair and an expression of permanent apology, stepped out to lock the door. "Evening, Inspector," he said. "No news tonight, I hope?" "None worth printing," Purbright replied, "though I suspect 1 or 2 citizens may soon supply some, if only by nervousness." He continued his stroll toward the canal, where the water reflected a dim trail of yellow light. The air was still. At the far end of the towpath, a solitary figure stood by the railing, half hidden by shadow. Purbright stopped a few paces away. "Good evening," he said quietly. The figure turned. It was Miss Cribb, her pale face caught for an instant in the glow of a passing bicycle lamp. She looked startled but not frightened, more like someone discovered rehearsing guilt. "Oh, Inspector, I didn't expect—" "Few people do," he said gently.
"Out for air, Miss Cribb?"
She nodded too quickly. "I saw the notice in the paper."
It seemed as if it might be about him, your employer."
"Yes. I thought if I answered, perhaps someone would tell me, well, something." Purbright studied her for a moment, his tone still calm. "You thought someone might be waiting for you here?"
"I don't know. I only wanted to see." Her voice wavered.
"It's so awful not knowing." "It is," said Purbright, "though sometimes knowing is worse." She looked down, hands twisting the strap of her handbag. "He wasn't a bad man, Inspector. Strict, yes, but he meant well. He didn't deserve whatever's happened." Purbright watched her quietly. "You cared for him?" The statement, not quite a question, seemed to loosen something in her. She nodded once, sharply. Yes, but he didn't notice. He never noticed anyone unless they were dead, or nearly so. A small, broken laugh escaped her. "I suppose that's fitting." "Did he ever confide in you, Miss Cribb?" Toward the end, she hesitated, then said in a low voice, "He said he'd done something foolish."
"Something that couldn't be undone."
"But he also said he could make it right if only he had a few more hours." Purbright's gaze lingered on her.
"And what did he do next?"
She shook her head helplessly. "Left, locked me out. I waited all night thinking he'd come back. He never did." A breeze stirred the water, carrying the faint smell of lilies and damp brick. Purbright glanced toward the darkened yard behind Blenkinsop's shop, then back at her. "Tell me, Miss Cribb, why did you come here tonight instead of to the Gazette office, as the notice asked?" Her eyes widened.
I thought perhaps he would be here. It's near where the organ tuner was found," Purbright finished for her.
"Yes, convenient, isn't it?" She flinched, as if struck, then whispered, "You think I had something to do with that?" "I think," said Purbright softly, "that you know who did." For a moment, there was only the sound of water lapping against the stones. Then she said very faintly, "I saw someone that night, near the back gate, a woman. She had a lantern." Purbright waited. "It was Mrs. Blenkinsop," she whispered. "She didn't see me. but I saw her go into the shop.
And later, I heard the splash. Purbright nodded once, almost gravely, as though she had confirmed something he had already half known. "Thank you, Miss Cribb," he said.
You've done the decent thing. He left her there, trembling and uncertain, and walked back toward the square. The mist was thickening, curling around the lamps like smoke. His expression remained unreadable, but his pace had changed, slower now, deliberate. It was a small thing after all, a single confession in a town built on propriety. Yet it was enough. Mrs. Blenkinsop, for all her dignity, had chosen the 1 hour in Flaxborough when even guilt could be mistaken for respectability. By the time Purbright reached his office, the advertisement had served its purpose. He removed the clipping from his desk, folded it, and placed it carefully in his pocketbook. Tomorrow would be time for courtesy, for questions phrased as condolences. But tonight belonged to silence, the kind that reveals more than words ever could. He looked out into the darkened street, faintly smiling. The test, it seemed, had passed itself. It was shortly after dawn when the news reached Inspector Purbright's office, delivered breathlessly by Constable Malley, who looked as though he'd run the entire way from the high street. The raincoat that flapped about him like a discarded sail did little to disguise the excitement beneath his usual politeness. "Sir," he said, half out of breath, "he's back. Mr. Blenkinsop walked into his own shop not 10 minutes ago." Purbright looked up from his notes, his expression one of quiet inevitability, as though this event had been penciled neatly into his morning schedule. "Did he indeed? In through the front door, I presume?" "Yes, sir." "Unlocked it himself, according to Mrs. Edge, at the post office. Said good morning as though nothing had happened." "That," said Purbright, setting down his pen, "is exactly what I should have expected of him." He rose, adjusting his cuffs with leisurely precision. "Come along, Malley. I wouldn't wish to keep the resurrected waiting." When they arrived, Blenkinsop and Son was indeed open. The blinds were half raised, the air inside faintly perfumed with polish and damp wool. Behind the counter stood Mr. Blenkinsop himself, paler, thinner perhaps, but unmistakably alive. He was dressed neatly in a dark suit that bore the creases of a long night's wear, and his eyes had that peculiar brightness of a man who has spent too long talking to no one. "Inspector Purbright," he said, inclining his head as though greeting a guest. "You've saved me the trouble of calling. I was on my way to you. Your consideration is appreciated," said Purbright mildly, "though I imagine the town would have preferred a word of reassurance before this morning's headlines." Blenkinsop smiled faintly.
"Yes, I suppose I've caused a stir."
"I meant to write, but certain matters detained me." "Indeed," said Purbright. "One might almost call them fatal." The Undertaker's composure wavered for the briefest instant before he gestured toward the back room. "Perhaps we might speak privately." They entered the dim office where everything remained precisely as Purbright had last seen it. The tidy ledgers, the faint scent of lilies, the clock ticking without sympathy. Blenkinsop stood by the desk, one hand resting on the back of a chair. "I've heard," he began, "about the man found in the canal." "Edward Reed," said Purbright. "Organ tuner, late of Gainsborough." "You knew him?" Blenkinsop nodded slowly. "I did. We had business. He was not an easy man." "Few of us are," murmured Purbright. "You argued with him here, I believe." Miss Cribb heard it. Blenkinsop sighed. "Yes, he came demanding money, said he knew things that could unsettle certain arrangements. I thought he was bluffing." "He wasn't. He had seen Mrs. Pell's new will before I filed it. Claimed it had been changed under false pretenses." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "False pretenses on whose part?"
"On hers, perhaps, or mine. It depends how you look at it." His hand trembled slightly as he rubbed the edge of his cuff.
"She asked me to witness her signature, said she'd already discussed it with her solicitor. She hadn't. When I realized, I told her we must start again properly, but she laughed. Said she was tired of clerks and wanted to be done with things. The next morning she was dead. Conveniently swift, said Purbright. Yes. And then Reed came, saying she'd promised him payment for something to do with that will. He wanted double what she'd offered.
I refused.
There was a struggle. He fell.
I didn't mean... He stopped, eyes clouded. I thought he was only stunned. I panicked.
There was the canal so near, and it seemed the simplest mercy.
Afterwards, I couldn't face it.
I locked up and walked. I walked all night until my shoes gave out. Purbright regarded him with an expression that might have passed for sympathy if one didn't look too closely.
And Mrs. Blenkinsop?
She knew you were alive. She found me 2 days ago.
I came to her at night. I thought she'd understand, but she told me to go back, to tell you everything.
Said she wouldn't live with a ghost? Purbright's gaze did not move from him. Your wife has a certain moral precision, he said, though she neglected to mention your visit. She thought you'd find me anyway. Quite right, Purbright said softly. He turned toward the desk and glanced at the open ledger. You've kept your accounts well, Mr. Blenkinsop. The living and the dead neatly separated. But one line's missing, I think. The cost of panic. Blenkinsop sank into the chair behind the desk, his shoulders drooping, as though the stiffness that had held him upright had finally dissolved. I only wanted to put things right, he murmured. Mrs. Pell's will, her nephew was meant to inherit. I planned to tell Mather, have it restored. But once the man was dead, I knew it wouldn't matter what I said.
No one would believe an Undertaker protesting innocence. Purbright was silent for a long moment.
Then, in his calm, precise way, he said, You're mistaken, Mr. Blenkinsop. In Flaxborough, innocence is always believed, so long as it's tidily expressed. At that, Blenkinsop gave a weary, almost grateful smile. You'll charge me then? In due course, said Purbright. For now, I think you'd best remain where you belong. The town finds comfort in seeing its Undertaker alive. It reassures them that death is still, for the most part, orderly. As they left the shop, the morning sun had climbed above the roofs, washing the street in pale gold. Mrs. Edge from the post office was already recounting the miracle of resurrection to anyone within earshot. Across the square the Crown's door opened, releasing the faint aroma of beer and curiosity. Purbright paused, adjusting his hat. Mally, he said quietly, keep a constable here tonight. Not for arrest, but for decency. Flaxborough prefers its guilty to fade gradually into respectability. Yes, sir, said Mally, still staring at the shop as though half expecting the man to vanish again. Purbright walked back toward the station at his usual measured pace. Behind him, the town had begun its latest conversation, half awe, half satisfaction. An Undertaker returned from the dead was too fine a story to waste. Yet Purbright knew the telling would soon wear smooth, its awkward edges polished by repetition, until only the moral remained. And somewhere, perhaps that evening, Mrs. Blenkinsop would sit alone with her gloves folded in her lap, considering the price of truth spoken too late. By the following evening, the rain had returned, a soft, steady fall that lent Flaxborough the kind of melancholy it wore well. The shop of Blenkinsop and Son was shuttered once more, though this time by choice, and in the window, among the wreaths and varnished caskets, a modest notice read simply, "Temporarily closed for family reasons." It was the kind of explanation the town understood immediately and questioned endlessly. Inspector Purbright stood beneath the shop's awning, his umbrella closed at his side. Inside a lamp burned low, and through the glass he could just make out the shape of Mrs. Blenkinsop moving from desk to counter, her gestures neat, deliberate. There was no sign of her husband. He entered quietly, removing his hat. The smell of polish and lilies had faded now to something cooler, almost medicinal. She turned at the sound of the door, and her expression, though weary, remained composed. "Inspector," she said, her voice steady but subdued, "I wondered if you'd come tonight." "I thought it best," he replied. "There are a few matters that ought to be set in order." She gave a faint, humourless smile. "You mean in writing or in conscience?" "Both, if possible," said Purbright. "Mr. Blenkinsop has made a full statement. I've just come from him." Her hand stilled against the counter. Then it settled, almost. "He's to be charged formally tomorrow."
Manslaughter, not murder.
"Your husband's account matches the physical evidence, and there's no suggestion of intent." She exhaled softly, the kind of sigh that holds both relief and resignation. He always said intent was the only respectable distinction left to mankind. Purbright allowed himself the smallest of smiles. "A philosopher to the end. He's tired," she said. "He didn't sleep at all last night. When he left this morning, I think he already knew you'd come for him."
He asked me not to make a scene.
"Not that I ever have." Her words lingered in the stillness between them. Purbright waited a moment before speaking again, his voice low. "You knew he'd come to you 2 nights ago?" "Yes." "And you let him go again?" "I told him he should face you." "He said he would when he'd arranged things." "I thought that meant his affairs." "It seems he meant his peace." Purbright studied her expression, composed, precise, unyielding. "He wanted to spare you the scandal," she shook her head.
No, he wanted to control it.
"He's always believed dignity could be arranged like funerals or apologies. I married a man who preferred remorse in good order." There was a long pause. Outside, the rain hissed softly against the cobbles. "You could leave town," said Purbright quietly. "Once this is over." "I might," she said, "but not yet."
There's still Mrs. Pell's funeral.
"It should be done properly." "Of course." She turned slightly toward the back room, as if already calculating flower orders and seating. "People forget, Inspector, that funerals are more for the living. They make it possible to go on pretending the world behaves." Purbright's tone softened. "And do you believe it does?" She looked at him then, a flicker of something almost like amusement in her eyes. "I did, until Flaxborough started drowning people." He inclined his head. "A fair observation." When he left her, the bell above the door gave its small, polite chime, an ordinary sound for what had been, in every way, an extraordinary week. The street was empty, save for the glow of the lamplight diffused by rain. Across the square, the Crown Hotel windows gleamed warmly, filled with silhouettes that moved and gestured, the town's machinery of gossip already in motion. Inside the hotel, the talk had reached a comfortable consensus. Blenkinsop had snapped, a word that explained everything and nothing. Mrs. Teat was already planning to send a basket to Mrs. Blenkinsop. Miss Pride was drafting a letter to the Gazette suggesting stricter licensing for canals, and Councillor Chubb had taken full credit for urging a moral reckoning from the start. Purbright passed through unnoticed, nodded to the landlord, and found his corner seat by the window. His pint arrived without being ordered. For a while he drank in silence, watching the faint, distorted reflections of the street ripple across the glass. Sergeant Love appeared a few minutes later, rain dripping from his coat. "He's resting comfortably at the station, sir. Said he'll make no trouble."
Asked if he might have his prayer book. Purbright nodded.
"A reasonable request." Love hesitated. "Do you think he's telling us everything?" "Nearly," said Purbright. "The rest he's left for his wife to decide. Between them they've arranged the story as carefully as any of their burials." Love looked down at his hands. "It's strange, sir, isn't it? All that care for appearances." "Not strange at all," said Purbright.
It's the currency of the town. Appearances are how we pay for our secrets. He glanced toward the bar, where laughter rose briefly and fell again.
"Flaxborough will forgive him in time. They like their scandals to fade neatly, like photographs. What matters now is that Mrs. Pell will finally be buried. The living require ceremony. The dead only patience." Love nodded uncertainly, then excused himself. Purbright remained where he was, his gaze drifting to the rain-slick street outside. The Undertaker's window was barely visible from here, but he could imagine it easily enough, the neat lettering, the orderly wreaths, the woman within keeping watch over what remained. He finished his drink and stood, slipping on his coat with unhurried precision. When he stepped outside, the rain had softened to mist. Somewhere down the street, a bell tolled 9 times, its tone even and indifferent. Purbright paused beneath the gaslight, the collar of his coat turned up, and allowed himself one final thought, not of guilt or justice, but of human frailty disguised as decency. It was, he supposed, Flaxborough's truest form of respect. He smiled faintly, a private expression unseen by anyone, and walked on through the rain toward the quiet office that waited for him, where paperwork, like conscience, never quite ended.